Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching an India Today special broadcast. This is the India Today CII Roundtable. Over the next 1 hour, we will take a very close look at whether the budget presented by Nirmala Sitharaman, the longest budget in India's history, 2 hours and 40 minutes long, will this budget help in reviving private investment? That is key to getting the India story back on track. Has the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister's government done enough to ensure that the men we've got around us and the women will start investing in the India story in an emphatic fashion? That's the critical question. Joining us to discuss, representing the Bharatiya Janata Party, one of its most articulate voices in economic affairs, I want to welcome Jayant Sinha, sir. Welcome. To my right, Manish Tiwari. He's been out with a sword fighting on behalf of the Congress, going after the budget and saying it isn't doing enough. Sir, welcome. Great to have you with us. To his immediate right, we've got Vikram Kirloskar, President of CII. Sir, great to have you with us. To my left, TV Narendran from Tata Steel. Suman Sinha joins us from Renew Power. Thank you to all our guests. I'll start with you, Jayant Sinha. You've had an opportunity now to look at the broad strokes contained in this budget. Explain to people sitting here and those watching why you believe this budget has done more than what was required to get private investment back on track.
No, it was the longest budget, as you're pointing out, Rahul, for a very good reason. Because it's meant to be a feel-good budget that addresses the concerns and needs of all the various stakeholders. And if you go through the budget in detail, you'll find whether it's farmers, whether it's the youth, whether it's women, whether it's the urban middle class, whether it's investors, every stakeholder has had their pain points addressed in a very substantive way. I want to highlight 3 or 4 things that I think are particularly notable that your viewers should take account. First, and because there was always this demand for a tax cut, a consumption boost, what is happening with the simplification of the tax code, as the Honorable Finance Minister points, their consumption and they can improve demand in the economy. So that's one. Second, the dividend distribution tax, another very notable feature, 20,000 crores going into the capital markets. It's going to provide a real boost for capital markets in the long run because it simplifies dividend payments.
So can we do it one at one? First, you said that the income tax regime has been simplified. More slabs have now been created. The tax consultants at Deloitte we spoke to said if you take away exemptions and then compare, people will be left with just a couple of thousand rupees each. The finance minister, on a salary of 15 lakh rupees, referred to 78,000 rupees, but that's only if in the previous regime that particular taxpayer wasn't availing any of the benefits, which naturally, whether it's on housing, whether it's on insurance, most people would have been. So you incorporate those and suddenly it doesn't seem as big a cut as it would have been.
No, that's not right, Rahul, because the Honorable Finance Minister, after having gone through all of those exemptions and deductions and everything else, all the fine print, all the detail, still came up with a net loss to the government of 40,000 crores. That's real money going into the hands of taxpayers, and so that is going to provide this big boost. The 20,000 crores, as I said, the dividend distribution tax is very powerful. The listing of LIC, I think, is another very strong signal.
So let's deal with dividend distribution tax. The markets at the end were almost 900 points down, from 700, 600, 400, 500. So if dividend distribution tax was a move which was done with the aim of reviving stock market sentiment and getting more foreign portfolio investment in, it doesn't seem to have had that impact, at least on budget day.
You can't, come to a conclusion based on one day. Remember that the Dow lost 600 points on Friday, so the markets were just dealing with absorbing that. I think in sum total, when everything is put together, people will realize that this is, in fact, as I said, a feel-good budget, the 20,000 crores
really
of dividend distribution.
Dow, whatever happened, that was in the first hour, just when the markets opened. After they heard the budget, whatever movement we've seen upside, downside, has both been on account of announcements in the budget, and you know much better than I do.
No, it takes time to absorb that, and of course there is selling pressure that comes from index funds and so on that are adjusting to what's happened with global markets. So once you take all of that into account, I think again, as I said, the markets will find their footing in the next few days, and that's what we have to look to. But again, as I said, let's focus on the 4 or 5 big things that have the most long-term impact. A tax cut for the urban middle class, tax cut for investors, simplification, number 3, of a variety of things as far as capital markets is concerned, including that government securities will be in bond indices, increase of FPI limits to 15%. So big boost for capital markets. For startups, lots to be done there, including the ESOPs, the profit tax reduction that has now been included and will go up to 10 years. That's a very big one. LIC, as I've already told you, the very fact that insurance cover on deposits, which was 1 lakh, has gone up to 5 lakhs.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
And that's important because if your bank goes bust, earlier you were insured only to the extent of 1 lakh rupees. Now that's been taken up to 5 lakh rupees. Vikram Kirloskar, would you accept that at least there's nothing negative there? Now, whether they've done enough or not is something you can argue about. Naturally, people would never be fully satisfied. But that being said, there is nothing for the industry or for the common man to be looking at negatively.
See, let me just go back a few months. You know, we had a lot of consultations with the finance minister, and we had one with the prime minister as well, and we brought out a lot of issues. I think the budget speech has probably got a little long because she's addressed a lot of the concerns. I think almost everyone who was there in our meetings and all the issues that were brought up, they were addressed in one way or the other. So I do appreciate that. I think the speech was long, but the concerns were certainly addressed. That was one part. But what was very good for me, very frankly, is besides the taxation he talked about and everything else, is trying to reset the trust deficit. I think that's very vital to change the sentiment in the economy to increase demand. You get the money, removing exemptions, you can argue how much exactly it will be. But frankly, a simplified tax system makes life easier. I prefer zero exemptions and straight
Manish
tax.
Tiwari, and the government would say, don't just look at what happened today, look at it in the context of all the mini budgets we presented over the past few months. If you add all of it together, this is as close to what you would call a dream budget, given the fact that we slashed corporate tax cuts very, very substantially just a few months ago.
Well, Rahul, you hit the nail on the head. There's a certain sacrosanct to the entire budget process. So you cannot have a budget and a budget 1.0 and a budget 1.5 and a budget 2.0 and a budget 2.5. So therefore, that essentially takes away from the entire sanctity of the budget. But, if you step back and look at it, even by the finance minister's own previous recorded grandstanding, this particular budget really took the cake because she went on for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which by any stretch, as you said, was the longest budget speech that we've had in the history of our republic. But essentially, what the budget fails to do is that you are trying to apply a very normative economic palliative to what is essentially a political problem. And the political problem is that with the kind of political discourse you have in the country, you cannot have economic development because social disharmony and economic development does not go hand in hand.
Harmony, disharmony can't be addressed in the middle of a budget speech.
So therefore, if you are going to continue with the kind of politics that this government at its highest echelons wants to continue with, I'm afraid you're not going to have a revival of demand. And the classical example is that you gave away 1,45,000 crores in revenue foregone when you adjusted the corporate tax rate in one of your mini budgets. But have you seen either a revival of investment or, for that matter, a revival of demand?
And it's not a switch that you turn on and off.
And the answer is that at least you would have seen some green shoots of it, and those green shoots are not visible at all. And in terms of simplification, allow me to complete, in terms of simplification of the tax regime, I think you've ended up complicating it even further, because earlier, you had 3 tax slabs, now you've raised them to 7. So for example, if somebody was in the 14 lakh bracket this year, moves to 15 lakhs and moves back to 14 lakhs, you're dealing with a whole range of nightmarish regulatory and compliance issues. So therefore, in a sense, the reason why the markets have reacted so negatively to the budget is, A, it has not done enough in terms of putting India's economy back on the revival path. And 2, most importantly, I think a lot of grandstanding has really left it to the states, to pick up the ball. And in the kind of very bitterly contested federal relationship that we have, I do not see the states really picking up the ball on that.
TV
yeah.
Narendran, credit offtake is at a historic low. Private investment is at a historic low, which is why we've got all of you over here. Do you believe this budget does enough to get India Inc. to start investing more aggressively in the India story?
Some parts of India Inc. will do that. Because,
Which parts?
For instance, if you look at the oil and gas sector, gas pipelines across the country, that helps people making pipes, helps steel companies. If you look at the focus on infrastructure, that also has, if you really spend the money, that has a snowballing effect. If you look at water for all, again, that triggers off a whole lot of activity. So I think there are parts of the economy which get positively impacted. I think the GST has helped supply chains. You see a lot of investments in supply chains and warehousing. Railways, where the government is spending money, is leading to some demand uptick. So companies supplying to these sectors will certainly see demand growth. But I think companies who are dependent a little bit more on the rural economy will probably wait to see more happen. I think didn't see much for the auto industry. Auto industry is also waiting for some better days ahead. So some parts of the economy will see positive demand.
Suman Sinha, one of the critiques we heard from one of the leading economists for this budget was that this could have been presented by any Modi finance minister in any of the past 6 years. This budget was presented under very special, unique circumstances where the economy has been slowing down. The challenge was to pump some new energy back into the economy. Has it done enough, or do you think it's just a usual budget? Does it reflect the fact that this is not a usual time and therefore this was an out-of-the-box budget? Do you accept that or not?
No, I think that you can't just take the budget in isolation. I think you have to look at all the things that the government has been doing for the last, let's say, 3-4 months and is likely to do for some more period of time, and look at all of those measures in totality to see whether the government is actually responding to the economic slowdown that we're facing right now. And I think if you take all of those measures together, within which the budget is one small part, I think you'll come to the conclusion that the government is trying to respond to a lot of the issues. I think one of the big things that they took a decision on in this particular budget was they decided to adhere to fiscal discipline. I think there's a lot of pressure on them to be expansionary on the fiscal side. They could have easily said, look, we're at 3.8%.
But it slipped from 3.3 to 3.8.
But that is because there was, in fact, a slowdown in the economy, as we all know. And so therefore that 3.3 is becoming 3.8. But for the next year, which is really what the budget was talking about, they could have easily said, look, let's make the number 4.5%. That extra 1% is going to give us $30 billion of extra spending, 2 lakh crores, and they could have liberally sprinkled that around in various places. And perhaps some of those things could have made us feel, at least in the short term, a lot better. And we could have all come out of it saying, look, this is really great, it's a budget stimulating this, that, and the other. I think what they've chosen to do is to go for the longer haul and not go for the immediate quick fix. And I think it's a decision that they've taken, I think, with a lot of, application of mind. And I think it has a benefit in that borrowings therefore are going to be lower of the budget or the government. Therefore, interest rates will be lower, and that therefore will have a longer term
and
stimulative.
Private investment can.
Will
Private
therefore,
industry
as well as consumer demand will also pick up.
Chandrajit Banerjee runs CII, and when we spoke to you at the World Economic Forum at Davos, you had made the point that the government should forget about fiscal deficit targets, spend money, because that's the best way of reviving consumption. The fiscal deficit target has indeed slipped by about 0.5%. Do you believe this budget does enough to revive consumption demand?
I think there is a lot of effort which has been put in to revive consumption. This entire thing that we were talking about, more money in the hands of the people, was itself quite something that goes towards boosting consumption. The focus that one has seen on the rural economy, which is consumed much part of the budget speech towards the beginning, shows itself that the government recognizes the need that needs to be done for the rural economy, and that also really helps boost consumption, and these two are critical triggers for growth and for the economy to pick up, which which really then also helps build the investment demand. So I think there is some good news when one really talks about how consumption demand could be built up into the budget.
One immediate reflection is how the stock markets react. The markets being 1,000+ points down clearly suggests they were expecting something which hasn't been done. Could it have been that they'd factored in the possibility of long-term capital gains tax being done away with completely, and that's not happened, which is why they're unhappy? Because part of what they wanted was dividend distribution tax being done away with. That
Yes.
didn't happen. It's moved from being in the hands of the company to being in the hands of the individual, which is the global norms. That's not such a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think I don't want to analyze what's happening in the stock market. That is beyond my capability. But then I would really like to say that some of the things that we had talked about in the taxation part, especially the DDT, is a wonderful thing to have happened. This is something that we were talking about, and these are things which really and the simplicity. Some of the simplification issues this has been brought about. Now I'll tell you what, decriminalization, when the Prime Minister talked about the focus to the wealth creators, the Finance Minister has adequately talked about it, and when we really look at something like decriminalization being mentioned in the budget after the last few months of deliberations, I think this is a very important signal also to the corporate sector that yes, we are here to work in
Mr.
partnership.
Forbes, this is something the government at different levels has now spoken of multiple times. Respect wealth creators, find ways of allowing wealth to be created, creating also a tax statute which allows for taxpayers to feel that they're not being harassed. Is this just talk? Because when you speak privately to corporates and to individuals, they say that's what they're saying, but look at what the taxman is doing. Or do you think the government's walking that talk as well?
I think they're starting to. I think we've not as yet seen really substantive changes on that front, but I think we're starting to now. There are now actually statutes that have been put forward to decriminalize a range of civil offenses. And I think that in itself will bring about a significant improvement in the tax terrorism environment. So I think it's starting to, but we've got a long way to go in this area of actually restoring trust in a substantive way to taxpayers and between taxpayers and the government.
Let Jain Sinha respond to that, because there seems to be a discrepancy between what's being said at the highest levels and what's being done on the ground by the taxmen. The government says respect taxpayers. You ask anybody, they'll not say this on camera. You wait for the cameras to go off and they'll say, isko notice aaya, usko notice aaya, he's being unfairly hounded, etc. Between what the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are saying and what their taxman is doing, there is still a big gap, sir.
Well, that gap is closing very quickly, Rahul, because if you look at all the different measures that have been undertaken, the faceless assessment, the fact that we are offering settlement schemes both for corporate taxpayers as well as for income taxpayers, the simplification that has happened, all of these are measures to ensure that there is no harassment, the very important taxpayer charter that has been announced, and the fact that this taxpayer charter is going to come as legislation, which means it will have the force of law, I think is a very powerful step. So clearly when you look at strategy, when you look at intent, the government really wants to clean up this area, wants to make sure that legitimate taxpayers don't have to face any harassment. Obviously there'll be discussions, there will be
Why is there a gap, Mr. Forbes, in your view, between what the government is saying and what the taxman is doing?
I think it's because bureaucrats don't like to give up power. So I think it will require very systematic cleaning up of the tax codes and the removal of discretion for bureaucrats systematically across the board. I think only as that really, there's a lot of detailed work that's required, which is what will actually bring about the change. Simply announcing it and then having the desire to do it will not bring about that change on the ground. I just wanted to say also that, you know, I think the two schemes earlier for corporate taxes, cases that are pending, and now in the budget for personal income tax cases are pending. Those are very useful, but they aren't settlement schemes, right? They basically say, accept the demand of the taxman, pay the full tax, and you don't have to pay the penalty or the interest. But the starting point is accept the demand of the taxman. If you don't accept the demand of the taxman, there's no actual settlement involved. So there's no actual sitting down and saying, let's settle what the demand is and then move ahead.
The government is now putting a lot of the onus on India Inc., saying that we've slashed corporate tax rates. Now India Inc. needs to step up to the plate and start investing in the India story. Private investment still at a historic low. Do you, Mr. Kirloskar, believe on the back? Because a lot of people are waiting to see the budget mein kya hai, then we'll decide. Do you see India Inc. now invest aggressively in the India story? Because there are consultancies that have set up separate divisions for rich Indians to take their money abroad and even take citizenship abroad if that's where they want to go, and that number too is at a historic high.
Last year has been very challenging. Last 18 months in my industry, it has been very challenging. We are down by, I don't know, 12, some companies 12, 15% in that range in the auto industry, everyone knows. And so capacity utilizations are much lower than what we have. We planned our present capacities based on, it takes 4-5 years to plan a capacity in the auto industry. So based on what was happening 3-4 years ago and what our expectations are. So to suddenly increase capacity in this industry when in the current situation without filling up what we have is not a viable issue.
Okay, so you're talking about the auto sector.
I'm just talking about the auto sector.
But zoom up, helicopter shot,
if I zoom
macro.
up and I go up to this corporate tax issue, corporate tax reduction, we are now more competitive with the rest of Southeast Asia on corporate tax, especially new companies. And I think you will see a lot more new businesses who will open up or start new factories in India. I know in people I know who've decided to invest here rather than Bangkok or rather than Thailand or Indonesia because of the change in corporate tax. But I think you'll start seeing those in the next few months.
Manish Tiwari, one of the things from the opposition's perspective is when things are already as badly off as they are, the only way really is up. So the economy is likely to bottom out either in this quarter or possibly the next, and from there things are only likely to get better.
Well, Rahul, if the economy bottoms out, whether in this quarter or the next quarter, we would be the happiest people, because eventually we do not believe in doing politics at the cost of the economy. But let me challenge one or two fundamental assumptions. You see, hypothetically speaking, if the slash in tax rates actually puts money into the hands of people, and as Mr. Sinha put the number at about 40,000 crores, it does not really translate into consumption straight away. Because for consumption, you require a different kind of an environment where people, have the confidence to spend. So therefore, this linear equation which the finance minister has worked out, that if you put more money into the hands of people, it essentially translates into greater consumption. I think that fundamental equation is erroneous till the time the macro environment which I mentioned earlier does not improve. The second is, this whole business of faceless appeals. As someone who earlier in my life had been the tax lawyer of the government, let me tell you, this is completely and absolutely unworkable. Faceless assessments at the first stage are workable. But when there is an appeal which gets filed by either the assessee or by revenue, there has to be a certain interface between the assessee's lawyers and the department. And if, let's suppose, you are going to file in Chandigarh and have your appeal adjudicated somewhere in Manipur, I'm afraid it's only going to increase the rent seeking and it is not going to decrease it. So therefore, when you are going to come down to the brass tacks of this being implemented, rather than simplification, you will see an increase in what Mr. Forbes, quote unquote, said tax terrorism, and which I call an increase in rent seeking. So I think fundamentally the enthusiasm which the budget was supposed to generate and which gets reflected in how the markets react in the first place has not happened. And there is something missing between the incentives that the finance minister, the government is trying to apply, and what's happening in the economy. And that's exactly what you pointed out, that consumption is at an all-time low. You have investment at an all-time low. Even FDI, even foreign direct investment. In fact, we've been, if I can break privilege with the permission of my chairperson, Mr. Jayant Sinha, in the Standing Committee of Finance, we've actually asked that all the FDI which has come in over the last 4 years, we want to know as to how much of it has gone in greenfield projects and how much has it gone in brownfield projects. Because what we are being told is a lot of that investments has gone to buy existing Indian companies, rather than create greenfield projects on the ground.
Virtually all of India Inc. Are you getting a sense that on the back of this budget, Indian industrialists will start investing in the India story, which is what the government very openly and privately is saying that you must?
Yes, of course, there is a lot of hope which the budget has given to the India Inc. across sectors and across different companies.
Which sectors do you see investments going up in?
So across sectors there is expectation. If you look at the FMCG sector, the auto sector, you look at even the steel sector.
He's saying we've got more capacity than we need, and there's no question of.
Technology is an issue. We need to invest in technology.
So, and even the auto sector does not expect this the downturn that they were in to be in for I mean, they look at going out of this downturn in the next 1 or 2 quarters, definitely. Yeah. So there is optimism, but there is also one issue which has come up, which is very strong, is a lot of good things in the budget, but there is a fear as to how will we implement them, and that's where a lot of.
Which parts do you think may not be implemented?
If you really look at the disinvestment target, if you look at the type of focus that one has given on the infrastructure side, and if how do you realize it, and a lot of it actually depends on how, again, there will be the power, the willpower, and the power to actually implement those targets.
That's an important point. One of the decisions taken in this union budget, which has generated a lot of chatter, is the decision to list LIC, the Life Insurance Corporation of India. Is that the right way to go? Also, on disinvestment, will this be the year when the government really starts selling some of its jewels, good, bad, ugly? Or will it again just be in the budget speeches and nothing will happen on the ground? Suman Sinha, let me put that question to you first. Do you really think that this, because of the fact that there's a serious crunch with revenue mobilization, the government will this time? Hardeep Puri said it, earlier there was an election, Islam ne nahi kiya, ab nahi hum karenge. He was pretty much said that. Will this be the year when we see serious disinvestment under the Modi Raj?
Well, I hope so, because a large part of the revenue receipts are predicated upon the privatization income.
So were they last year, but nothing.
So percent of this year's target. So it's got, therefore, a much more sizable impact. Now, having said that, they actually have a few things in motion. There is Air India. Hopefully, they get some money out of it. Time will tell. BPCL, of course, is a big one. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the LIC IPO. Now, I don't know what the market cap of LIC might be, maybe $40–50 billion. I mean, I'm just shooting in the dark. But even a 10% sale of that perhaps would fetch them, a few $1 billion, maybe 40–50,000 crores. So that could be a big one. But I think beyond just collecting money from strategic sales, I think there's also the benefit by privatizing LIC is to actually give it a higher degree of scrutiny. Today, it's a 100% government-owned entity, and so therefore a lot of things happen.
It's like a cookie jar. Whenever you need a cookie, just dip into it.
Yeah, so therefore perhaps going forward with as a listed company, there'll be a high degree of scrutiny, and perhaps that will result in an improvement in performance of LIC over time and lead to it becoming a true professional.
Or it could also throw up all the jiggery pokeri that's been happening in the LIC numbers, and where that money's been going will suddenly have a spotlight on that, which is a good thing. I think that's a good thing.
Exactly.
Because there is scrutiny to it. Jayant Sinha, you tried to sell Air India previously. That attempt didn't go through. You're seeing the terms and conditions of the new Air India disinvestment deal. Do you believe that somebody will step forward and buy Air India and this will be off the... What kind of revenue mobilization can come through it?
No, we are very hopeful that this time the Air India disinvestment will go through. Last time there were two aspects that made it very difficult. One, the external conditions changed against us. The rupee was a little weaker, oil prices had gone up, so external conditions were not quite as favorable. And secondly, we had quite a bit of debt on Air India, even at that time, 28,000 crores of actual debt plus another 20,000 crores of liabilities. This time around, we've made it a much more attractive offer, and external conditions are very benign. Of course, with Jet Airways not being in the market anymore, Air India's share, particularly of long-haul flights, is now higher than it's ever been before. So it makes
so at the World Economic Forum, I had an opportunity to ask a few of the likely suspects that would you be interested. Most of them said, they laughed it off and said, you have to be completely crazy or very emotional to want to come in. Just purely from a financial perspective, Air India makes no sense. So you have to really invoke the tricolour, national pride to bring people in.
Well, I mean, I'm going by what the Honorable Aviation Minister said, and he just had an interview in the newspaper recently where he said that it's attracted quite a bit of interest. Maybe they weren't at Davos, Rahul, so maybe you didn't speak to them, but that's at least what Hardeep ji said. So I think we are very hopeful as far as Air India is concerned, and certainly when it comes to assets like BPCL, which is an extraordinarily well-run company, and LIC, which is a very, very solid company. We just, at the Standing Committee on Finance in our review of LIC, Maniji was also there, were quite surprised and amazed at how well it's continued to do. It's maintained market share even though lots and lots of new companies have come into the insurance industry. It's got a very transparent and well-run on investment committee as well. But more discipline as far as being in the markets is concerned is going to be good for them. It's going to make them more competitive. It'll make them stronger. So it's actually one of those situations, Rahul, which is a real win-win. It's a win in terms of revenue generation and a win also in terms of strengthening LIC.
But some of this, Mr. Banerjee, we've heard in the past from government. Ambitious targets and disinvestment not being kept. Do you believe that the level of the water in the Yamuna has risen so much that there is absolutely no option but to push through, plus there's no election? Or do you think it's again something that we'll see being discussed today but not much follow-up on?
Yeah, unfortunately, India is a country of elections every year, so that's a separate matter. But yes, I do believe that. But I mentioned that one of the most trickiest things in the budget is perhaps this entire issue of implementation. But having said that, I do see strong willpower, and I do see things on paper which are pretty much gives us confidence that there should be the right efforts for the.
We know the likes of Sitharaman, Yechuri, Mr. Tewari, and the left will oppose this. Will the Congress be reasonable? Because when the cameras are not rolling, everybody realizes listing LIC is a good idea, disinvesting BPCL and Air India are good ideas. Would that be your public position as well?
Well, essentially, Rahul, if you read the economic survey has erroneously framed the debate between socialism and neoliberal economics. Now, neoliberal economics is a model which has failed, and that's why you see rising right-wing populism, you see a move from globalization towards near proximity. So therefore, for India to even persist with the neoliberal economic model is something which needs to be seriously questioned. Number two, India's had a very robust public sector over a period of time. Since 1991, we've tried to adjust that economic model. But before the government goes ahead with any kind of disinvestment or privatization, the opposition is going to insist that the government put on the floor of Parliament its public sector policy. Does the government believe that there should be a public sector in India? If the government believes that there should be a public sector...
Why is it an extreme?
It's not an extreme.
You wanted to disinvest Air India. Manmohan Singh and his government never had the courage. Now a government is trying to muster the courage. Let them do their job,
well, in the sense they tried earlier and they failed, but I think there's a far more...
despite wanting to...
There's a far more fundamental point. The fundamental point is that over the past 70 years, we've built up a public sector with people's money. And so therefore, before the government goes ahead and disinvests, it must put in place and it must articulate, does it have a public sector policy? What are the ingredients of the public sector policy? What are those areas of the economy which it would like to keep in the public sector? And last, all these privatizations are going to be challenged in a court of law. And hopefully, I would be one of the lawyers doing it. Hopefully, I would be one of the lawyers doing it.
Even before we got started.
I think there are very serious issues which going forth will need to be clarified before government's privatization program.
You bold one googly, let me bold one googly to Mr. Narendran. It's the Tata Group that originally owned Air India. There's been a lot of buzz in the pink press that this could ultimately go back to the Tata Group. We've seen also, very interestingly, Vistara write to Air Asia saying that there's no compete agreement now we need to deal with. Is all of that building to a historic return of the Maharaja to the Tata Group?
I'll just supplement to that. Vistara also has been making historical quarter-on-quarter losses. I think last quarter it was 600 crores down. So therefore, that's something which they'll also have to deal with. There is nobody in the aviation industry.
And when they try and generate some revenue, I will fight you in court. I will be the lawyer myself.
Rahul, there are structural issues in the aviation industry which the government has to deal with. So therefore, the reality is that nobody in the business, I think leaving aside Indico or somebody, is really making money today, including Vistara.
I'll have to step in here, Manish.
Let's see whether we have a bidder or not. We'll come to the government in a moment. Do we have a bidder?
That is one who leaves the right balls.
No, but first, you're very clear. The opposition won't allow this to go through. I thought it would be Sitharaman Yechuri and the CPIM, Manish Tiwari very clearly putting the Congress also on that same side, even though I believe that's really unfair because Manmohan Singh and his government kept saying they wanted to do it. When now you got a government ultimately trying to push this through, the opposition has already begun the copying. Mr. Sinha.
I think, first of all, let me answer Manish's point about the aviation industry not doing well. The aviation industry is doing extraordinarily well, and you can just see that from the market cap of companies like Indigo and SpiceJet, which have really, really accelerated. Now, obviously, in a market economy, you're going to have some winners and some companies that are not going to do so well. That's exactly how competitive markets work. That's how liberalization was intended to be, and we've had extraordinary growth, extraordinary investment in the airline industry, and of course in airports as well. And so all of us today are enjoying the benefits of our world-class airports and our very competitive and excellent airline companies. So this is one of the great success stories of our government, and so I would not for one moment accept what Manishji is saying about
globally,
about the airline industry not doing well.
has amongst the lowest margins across all
that's
sectors.
not the right way to look at it, Rahul. The right way to look at it, as any investor will tell you, is what is the equity IRR. And you have to look at the airline industry. If you look at airports, you look at equipment suppliers, their capital investment is high and their equity IRRs are high, they're very profitable as well. In the airline industry, because it's been completely variabilized, everything is leased by and large, everything is negative working capital, therefore the equity IRRs are actually very high. You put in not a lot of equity and you get actually fairly good returns across the cycle, and that's why market cap of a company like Indigo today is 75-80,000 crores. If Indigo or SpiceJet were not doing so well, their market cap would not be so high. So they're creating value, and they're creating value because equity holders, by putting in less equity, are generating very substantial cash profits across the cycle. And so that's why the airline industry is doing
Mr.
well.
Forbes, do you think that this is where the government really needs some backing? Because they're finally trying to move on LIC, on BPCL, on Air India. The flip could be that this is not the right time. You can try and disinvest, but the ecosystem isn't conducive to generating good values.
Well, actually, I think the ecosystem is conducive to generating good value. The stock market, not counting today, the stock market has been doing very well. And that's a good time to actually disinvest. So I think it's, I would like to see a very aggressive privatization push. I would like to see privatization used as the word rather than disinvestment, because we otherwise keep skirting around the issue. I would also make the prediction that if Congress comes to power in the future, they will then support the policy that's been carried through of disinvestment or privatization, even if they may oppose it in the short run. But I think, you know, I see LIC happening as an IPO. I see Air India happening because there's so much focus from the government now to make it happen. I don't think Air India in itself will raise any money for the government. I think, on the contrary,
you'll stop bleeding.
Well, you'll stop the bleeding, which is very beneficial. But in the short run, it will actually, you know, privatizing Air India will actually lead to a minus in the deficit, because one will basically take 30 or 40,000 crores off Air India's books onto the government's own books. And then probably get much less than that for the actual sale of the company. So it will actually be a minus for the deficit, but it's the right thing for the airline, and it's the right thing in the long run.
You know, one of the big debates is, when everybody is moving towards your sector, which is the renewable energy sector, how does that impact the potential value of a company like BPCL? The flip side could be that's way too much in the future. It won't impact what's going to happen this year.
No, I don't think there's any relationship between the two, because BPCL is an oil and gas company into retail distribution. Renewable energy is really, in the power sector space, so the two really don't overlap. But if I can just make a point to, or react to a point that Manish was making, which is, he said the government should articulate the public sector strategy. I think that's not a bad idea, actually. Why don't all political parties come out on what their public sector strategy is? What is the strategy on public sector banks and so on as well? And let's have an honest debate about that, and let different parties come up with what their view is. And in fact, why even public sector strategy? Why don't we have a debate on economic strategy as a whole? I'd be very keen to hear what the Congress's economic strategy is, what in fact the BJP's economic strategy is, and let's actually have a much fuller debate and discussion on a lot of these very important issues. Today what happens is that people who in government behave in a certain way, people in opposition, same people in opposition behave in a very different way, and there's constant sniping at each other. Why don't we actually have a proper discussion about what different people's economic views are, what they stand for, what their philosophy is?
What their view on economics
I think there's nothing wrong with
depends on
that.
which side of the political divide they're on. If they're in opposition, their view will be very different.
That's not correct, Rahul. I beg to disagree. See, therefore, a lot of this privatization and disinvestment, which actually started off when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee was at the helm of affairs, was opposed by the Congress even then for essentially the reasons which I have articulated. In fact, if you remember correctly, some of those downstream oil marketing companies were taken to court, and the privatization could not go forth. So therefore, what is being said actually is the way forward, that you need a fuller debate on what is the economic model India requires, because you've had the chief economic advisor bat very aggressively for the neoliberal economic model. But if you look around the world, the neoliberal economic model is really failing. And so therefore, a country our size, with our kind of diversity, our kind of demographics, is that the correct economic model, or we need a hybrid, is something we need to have a discussion on.
I have time only for final.
It's a very simple debate. Manish ji has been using some labels. Let me use some labels right back at him. It's very clear that BJP is for entrepreneurship, wealth creation and transparency. Those are the words in the budget. It's very clear that the Congress is for crony capitalism and socialism. That's how their policies have been. That's what they were for 10 years. With those labels, I think we can close the economic debate right
Well,
here.
let me just
Socialism
add one.
is where the Venn diagrams meet.
Rahul, let me add a line to that. With all the epithets which Mr. Jayant Sinha has used, we still did 8.02% year on year for 10 years, and you have an economy which is down at 4.5%. So whose economic model actually did better? I think the jury's out on that.
So I have time only for final words. I'm not going to get the industrialists in on who did better, Manmohan or Modi. That's a debate for another matter with people who've got less at stake. But, Mr. Banerjee, this government's been criticized for not using its political capital to push through major economic change. With the corporate tax cuts, we saw that play out in a substantive way. Do you believe that pushing through on disinvestment, regardless of what Manish Tiwari and others in the Congress party and in the opposition feel, is an opportunity for the government to walk that talk in the field of economics?
100%, and I think the government should and would. The business of government is not business. I think they need to get out of business. There's no doubt about that, and number one. And that's what big ticket issues. This government is known for some big issues being brought in, and they are being able to implement them. So I would think that there is a huge hope that while these big stuff has been announced, they need to now move ahead to implement it, which not only triggers the economy, but it really takes us much beyond. And I think that's possible, and I would bet on it.
Mr. Kirloskar, do you have this grudge that there is too much tinkering with fine print? There are bureaucrats there who like to create slabs at every 2.5 lakhs. Some of it should just be simplified, genuinely simplified, and pushed ahead instead of allowing for so much bureaucratic tinkering.
I think last 2 years, okay, I don't want to get into this little thing, but last couple of years, there have been some pretty big ticket items which are going on, which have created a discord in the economy. And I think that's why the economy is going through a tough time.
You don't want to see any more big ticket changes?
No. The big ticket items have to happen. One is tackling the bankruptcy issues, the bank issues head on. Okay, taking the hits on the NPAs, taking the hits, the hits on the banks. You had no choice. You have to do that. Second is GST. GST, I think, has been, especially for large industry, a game changer. It has made us far more efficient, and it's widened the tax base. These are big ticket items. Okay, and maybe it can't get sorted out in 1 year or 6 months. It takes, it's a rollout of 2-3 years before things get sorted out. And along with this, I think an emphasis on corporate governance and ethics. You cannot build a world-class industry in India unless you have world-class corporate governance and ethics. I think these are three major issues, and these are things which cannot be sorted out. I'll say in my budget, and 1 quarter later, everything is over.
Mr. Forbes, while we've agreed that Air India and BPCL should be disinvested, there is still no agreement on disinvesting public sector banks. Do you think that's a missed opportunity? The fact that just HDFC has more market cap than all the government banks put together. Do you think that's one area where the government needs to show some himmat, the 56-inch chhati, that's where we need to see it? Or do you think it's too tricky, you'll burn your hand, whoever puts his hand into it?
If you look at the economic survey, it has a very strong argument in favor of privatization. But it has a separate chapter on public sector banks where it's very mealy-mouthed. It sort of says, we must use fintech, we must, improve efficiency, etc. These are, I think we should go down the road.
Why can't we see that much
actual
touted 56
privatization of the
chest
banks
on an issue which everybody would accept is the way to go?
It'll solve
Disinvest not all, but at least some of those public sector banks.
We have taken on some very big issues. For example, consolidation of the banks. We've taken on GST, we've taken on bankruptcy, we've done demonetization, we've improved tax compliance. So we've dealt with a lot of very, very big issues. And in fact, initially I remember when Arunji was finance minister, the conversation always was, where is the big bang reform? Then we had a whole spate of big bang reforms, and now, you know,
now they're scared of
Mr. Kirloskar ji is saying, let it stabilize, let it settle down. So, you know, there is a lot in terms of sequence and timing. So let's these big issues settle down.
But you haven't even on this signaled intent. No one in the government, and neither you on the show will say the way to go is to disinvest some of the public sector banks. Would you say so, sir?
The important thing to do is competitiveness, not disinvestment. So we have to make sure our banks are competitive, that they are in a position where they can compete with the best private sector banks around the world, and at that point decisions can be made. But right now we have to go through that process. We've just pumped 3.5 lakh crores into these banks. We've just consolidated a number of banks, and in fact, coming back to Manish ji's point about performance, let me tell you, they were benefiting from all the fabulous work that Atalji's government did. They had that great tailwind. We were dealing with the overhang of the mess that they had left behind. Even then our performance is better. So you look at what we have been able to do in terms of structural reform. You look at what we've been able to do in terms of reorienting the economy, making it globally competitive, innovation driven, making the ecosystem today very vibrant, the third largest ecosystem in the world. That's really what we have accomplished.
Is the government demonstrating adequate risk appetite when it comes to economics?
Look, I think that's obviously a great question. I think they have in the past. They've taken certain fairly large decisions. Sometimes they haven't really gone the way the government might have wanted them to go, and perhaps that has made them a little bit more cautious about attempting very, very large things, which is also not a bad thing. I think if you do a lot of incremental things over a long period of time, that also adds up. And I think also you're dealing with a bureaucratic system that, as you said, sits down and looks at everything in many, many different ways. So I think let's be practical. Let's recognize the fact that we have a certain political system, and you've seen some sort of witness of that right here in our panel discussion. So I think we have to learn to live with that, and that's really what we have to do.
And have nothing to crib about are the chartered accountants, because everyone's coming to them. You know, certain more clarity to help people run calculations themselves. Everybody's coming to the chartered accountants.
That's economic.
Unke achhe din to aa gaye. They've got achhe din. We've had an interesting conversation. You've had different dimensions, both good, bad, ugly, being brought out. I want to thank these guests for joining us, and we'll keep tracking where the economy goes under Modinomics. Thank you so much for joining us on this special broadcast. We'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us.
Hi everyone, Preeti Chaudhary here. Hope you like this video. For latest news and analysis, like and subscribe to the India Today YouTube channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated. Thank you for watching.